I'm Dr. Zain Yao, and I'm the lead for this week of the Arts and Humanities induction that titled The Matter of Black Lives. So I'll just be starting off with a little bit of an overview of the rationale behind this week and some brief mention of the events that have already happened, and then I'll be introducing our roundtable. When we say Black Lives Matter, who is saying it, to whom, and for whom? For whom has it always been evident? And when the media says that there has been a or into whom are we discussing this? The murder of George Floyd was the spark that catalyzed this resurgence for a global non-Black audience. But we have to also remember that quite a number of other Black people of other genders have also been murdered during the same time, that Breonna Taylor still has to see justice, that also there have been victims such as trans man Tony McDade. And I think this is a good occasion to remember the importance of intersectionality, which as a term has become so popularized and yet often tends to mean anything with intersections. But as a reminder, it was a term that was created by a Black woman law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, to specifically talk about the way that Black women in particular tend to be erased by analyses that only look at race or only look at gender. And Black Lives Matter as a movement was founded by 3 queer Black women. And it's remarkable how mainstream the movement has come since Ferguson, since Colin Kaepernick took the knee and jeopardized his career, that now we see corporations releasing their Black Lives Matter statements. But what does this mean for those of us outside the US, and how can we respond to the challenges of Black Lives Matter within the UK? To put into perspective, since we're an institution of higher education, in the UK, as of the beginning of this year, as far as I'm aware, there are only 27 Black women who are full professors. That is the most senior position that one can attain as academic, only 27 in the UK across all disciplines. And we might also then consider what the place is of Black academics at UCL, Black students, Black PhD students. And it's often that I tell my colleagues in North America about these statistics, and they react with a lot of shock, saying, well, London is so diverse. And I say, well, it's very striking what the difference is when you, and so I see the organization this week as inspired by Black Lives Matter and organized by someone like me as a non-Black person of color to be in solidarity to help to take up some of the labor that academics of color, primarily Black academics, have been called upon in this moment. And framing this discussion, earlier this year, we had the commission on the UCL inquiry into the history of eugenics at our institution come to a close. And I think that this is a legacy that I strongly encourage, especially our incoming students, to look up. If you look at the events page, we've linked a number of the resources and podcasts that talk a little bit about the history, specifically at UCL. I recommend you check them out. They're fantastic. And among the statements that were made by the founders of eugenics include, of course, a lot of racist comments, but particularly some very foul anti-Black ones that I won't repeat. And so these are the conditions of the production of knowledge that we're engaging with at UCL, that these are the conditions from which we are living, learning, and teaching together. And I think that's something to be aware of, because identity is not synonymous with analysis, but it is important to acknowledge how that is a starting point for all of us, and the ways that the analysis of the individual can lead us to the structural and systemic. So earlier in this week, on the matter of Black Lives, we first started off with feminist science fiction, starting with the classic short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and then paired with N.K. Jemison's Afrofuturist rebuttal, The Ones Who Stay and Fight. And you could see from the title right away, this very different orientation of politics and this the different forms of feminist science fiction. And for those of you who haven't been keeping up with some of the arts and culture news, Jemison just recently was awarded with the MacArthur Genius Grant. Highly recommend that you check out these short stories. Professor James Wilson gave us a fantastic talk thinking about thought experiments and ethics in science fiction. Yesterday, we had our film club event centered around Janelle Monáe's 2018 visual album, Dirty Computer, which started us off with Rolake Asabia's overview of Black feminism, and then went into Dr. Jonathan Ward's analysis of Black queerness and Black joy in Janelle Monáe's work. And I'm very excited to finish off our week with this session on disciplines and decolonization, and that there's a deliberate pun that we're drawing out in terms of disciplines, that it's not just about the interdisciplinarity of arts and humanities, but the way that the disciplines serve to discipline us and how they end up being disciplinary. And also the question of decolonization and whether or not that word is applicable. If you had a chance to look at the original lineup, I'm afraid that Professor Azzedine Haddour from Selks is unable to be with us tonight, but I highly recommend you check out his work. He works on Francophone literatures, particularly post-colonial literature, with an interest in Algerian literature and Francophone and decolonization. I do hope you'd be able to catch him at some point because his work is fantastic. So first, our event is being chaired by Professor Paul Gilroy, who's one of the foremost theorists of race and racism working and teaching in the world today. He is the author of foundational and highly influential books such as There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, Against Race, Postcolonial Melancholia, and Darker Than Blue, along with numerous key articles, essays, and critical interventions. Gilroy's is the unique voice that speaks to the centrality and tenacity of racialized thought and representational practices in the modern world. He has transformed thinking across disciplines from ethnic studies, British and American literature, African American studies, Black British studies, transatlantic history, and critical race theory to postcolonial theory. He has shaped and contributed to thinking on Afro-modernity, aesthetic practices, diasporic poetics and practices, sound and image worlds. And then to our roundtable. First, we have Dr. Seth Anziska, who is the Mohammed S. Farsi Polonsky Associate Professor of Jewish-Muslim Relations at UCL. His research and teaching focuses on modern Middle Eastern history, Israeli and Palestinian society and culture, and contemporary Arab and Jewish politics. He is the author of Preventing Palestine, A Political History from Camp David to Oslo from Princeton University Press, which was awarded the British Association for Jewish Studies Book Prize in 2019. Congratulations. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, and he is currently working on an international history of the 1982 Lebanon War, supported by the British Academy and Leverhulme Trust. Next, we have Dr. Melanie Ramzan-Bold, who is Senior Lecturer or Associate Professor in the Department of Information Studies, where she researches and teaches topics relating to publishing and book cultures. She's currently working on several projects that explore issues of diversity and inclusivity in children's and YA publishing. Her books include Inclusive Young Adult Fiction, Authors of Color in the United Kingdom, and Book Trade and Activism and Anthologies, Advocating for Change in the UK YA Market. She is currently working on a collaborative interdisciplinary research project, Adolescence Identities, with Dr. Leah Phillips. This project investigates how YA reflects the realities of minoritized readers. They have been working closely with schools, libraries, and bookshops, hosting reading groups and focus groups with teenagers across the country, and engaging with the wider YA and book community online. While unfortunately she was unable to be with us today, she has recorded a short video about her work. Next, we have Professor Feroz Basunio, who has research and teaching interests in the study of cross-cultural contact, colonialism, and end empire. His works include The Gift of the Nile and The Classics in Colonial India, among numerous other publications. He is the general editor of the book series, Ancients and Moderns. Forthcoming volumes include The Politics of Form in Greek Literature and The Oxford Handbook of the Literatures of the Roman Empire. A current work in progress is a monograph on postcolonialism and the study of antiquity. And he is a professor in the Department of Greek and Latin at UCL. Finally, to fill in Azadine's spot, I am also speaking. So I'm Dr. Zainao, and I'm lecturer in American Literature to 1900. My first book, Disaffected, The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th Century America, is forthcoming with Duke University Press. My articles on the politics of race, gender, and sexuality have appeared in numerous journals, one of which was a finalist for the Constance M. Brooke Prize for Best Essay in American Quarterly. My honors have included the ASA Yasao Sakakibara Essay Prize, and my research has been supported by grants from SSHRC. I'm currently a BBC Radio 3, AHRC New Generation Thinker, and the co-host of PhD Divas podcast, which is a podcast about academia, culture, and social justice across the STEM humanities divide. And I'm proud to say that in my first year at UCL, I won the Student Choice Teaching Award for Diverse and Inclusive Education, and I co-organized UCL's first trans symposium. So after that lengthy introduction, we'll turn to Paul Gilroy.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Diane, for that extremely generous and excessive introduction. If colleagues and people in the meeting will indulge me, I've been offered a chance very briefly about the Sarah Parker Riemann Center, which I direct here at UCL. I wanted to take this opportunity to abuse my time just to introduce the center and its work to incomers, and to urge you to join in the activities and seminars and exchanges that we have planned for you in the period ahead. The Centre is really a new initiative from UCL. It was established in 2019 in response to student-led demands for the transformation of the curriculum and a kind of reparative reckoning with the powerful but often unacknowledged colonial and imperial histories of our university. The issue of eugenics has already been mentioned, but also of our city and of our nation. We're based in IAS, but we work closely with many partners and stakeholders on site, and the Centre aims to accommodate a unique and multidisciplinary community of students, of teachers, and of researchers. I think I can say its primary aim is to provide a kind of focal point for scholarship, teaching, and public engagement activities addressed to various problems of racial inequality and hierarchy that are already, in many cases, being explored in teaching and research conducted at UCL. Our core team will be together in January, and we're very excited about the incomers coming in. It's comprised of myself in the broad fields of literature and culture, one colleague trained in anthropology and another trained in geography. So we'll have especially close connections with those departments, as well as links, I think, to many colleagues who share our commitment to the rigorous academic study of racism and racialization from their own disciplinary perspectives. I think I should emphasize that alongside the Centre's role in coordinating and facilitating existing initiatives, we really are committed to the production of new, historically informed critical knowledge addressed to some of the most urgent social and political questions of our time. Our affiliates will explore the impact of racism in scientific, metaphysical, and cultural forms on the development of all varieties of academic inquiry. And I think there's a special interest in the complex legacies of race thinking across the humanities and social sciences, as well as the continuing effects of racialized inequality in the workings of government, law, the arts, culture, science, technology. The Centre is really grounded in academic humanities and mindful of the significance of culture, literature, and the arts in the development of movements against racial hierarchy. I think apart from our commitment to scholarly practice at a high level, the work is not only scholarly. The work we've begun to do, and will do more of it in future, is outward facing, dedicated to kind of patterns of public engagement with a full range of Black and minority ethnic global majority communities around us. And when we're really up and running, I can say we've received a support from the Centre at UCL to begin some sort of small activist in residence program, collaborating with key NGOs and civil society partners in this city. I mention that because our location here in London is really something that we see as an important asset, and our approach to all aspects of our work here is both transnational and global in character. We therefore endorse comparative research, relational research into these worldly issues, and in present circumstances, we're especially keen to contribute to broader European discussion about the continuing problems of exclusion, inclusivity, and belonging that result from the conjunction of racism with resurgent forms of nationalism. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm mindful of the time, and I think that's enough. But I really would urge you to come and join us. Check out our list of podcasts. We've been really working very hard since the lockup happened to project the work out through podcasts that reflect the range of interests in our grouping. And at the moment, we're really concentrating on dialogue with Black European voices in the academy and beyond. So that's the series of podcasts that we're putting together at the moment, and we've got a lot lined up for the new year. We've got a lot of events lined up for the new year. I don't know if you're new to London, if you're new to thinking about these things, you may have appreciated that 2021 is a special year in that it represents 40 years since the riots of the summer of 1981, 40 years since the march, the Black People's Day of Action March, took the anguish and anger about the effects, the after effects of governmental and juridical and popular indifference to the horrible fire in New Cross into the city. And many people, I think, both historians and perhaps from more activist perspectives, remember that winter of 1981 as the birth, really, of a kind of self-conscious political community amongst Black people in this country. So we're going to be looking at that and remembering those events and talking to participants from that time. And we really want to make that the focus of our practice, our outward-looking practice next term. It's the name George Floyd has already been mentioned, I think, but the names of David Oluwale and Asetta Sims and the other Black people who have died at the hands of police or prison authorities or immigration authorities, I think of Joy Gardner. People don't know those names, and much of that history and much of that information isn't really available online. So we aim to kind of act as a kind of facilitator in the recovery and the salvage of those memories, because they are very, very important to the way we think about what's happening around us now.
Thank you so much, Paul. And our first panelist is Seth.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Zena and Paul, for inviting me and for having me here today. I'm really delighted to join all of you at the end of this first week of term. And I wanted to come to this conversation both as a historian of the Middle East and also somebody working on Israel and Palestine in particular. But I think the questions we're exploring in this conversation are actually constitutive of the wider fields that all of us come from. And from my own department in Hebrew and Jewish studies, as both a discipline and as a department, some of the same kinds of questions have been animating lots of the debates within the field of Jewish studies as well. So I'm going to try, if I can, to share my screen, and these are going to be a few slides. And I'll just say that the focus of my remarks today, I'm going to talk specifically about events or issues in Israel and Palestine. But I should say that from our own survey course on the history of the modern Middle East that we've met for the first time this week, the questions about how to think about the concept or idea of the Middle East itself as an ideational construct, which is wrapped up in colonial history, and in particular against the backdrop of debates ignited by Edward Said's publication of Orientalism in 1978, have forced these kinds of questions across the entire field of Middle East studies. And we're constantly needing to navigate and interrogate the politics of knowledge production about non-Western regions of the world and our own subjectivities as scholars and students of the region. And I think in the case of Israel and Palestine, you have a pretty concentrated focus on some of these questions as well. So I wanted to talk through a few ways in which this particular field, where my own research and teaching is located, has grappled with some of the questions around decolonization of disciplines. And I think the natural place to really begin is to talk about 1948, which some of you will know is the locus point of thinking about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because for Israel and the birth of the Israeli state, it represents the year of independence and the emergence of a state after the political struggle of Zionism to achieve national sovereignty for Jewish community in Palestine, at the same time that this represents the moment of dispossession for Palestinians, with the expulsion of over 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and from their villages and towns into the diaspora and also into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so most historians who are teaching about Israel and Palestine in some way have to navigate how these questions of decolonization intersect with how we tell the history of the war. And in particular, in the case of the 1948 war, one of the biggest obstacles to telling that history and to understanding what actually happened has been the question of archival access and who can actually tell the history of 1948. And for many, many years after the creation of the state, the dominant narrative within Israeli society was about the success of the emergence of the Israeli state and the unfortunate events of the war having been a byproduct of the violence and the fighting, but that the Palestinians who were living in places like Haifa or Jerusalem or Jaffa had left on their own accord. This was kind of a traditional Zionist narrative about the 1948 war. And in the 1980s, we had a whole group of Israeli critical revisionist historians who discovered in Israeli archives evidence that many of these refugees had actually been, or all of them had been expelled in the process of the fighting and driven out through systematic and non-systematic violence that was exacted upon the local population during the war. And this discovery, so to speak, of the new historians and the archival evidence, historians like Benny Morris and Avi Shleim, led to a kind of debate within Israeli society about moral responsibility for the making of the refugee problem. But one of the most, I think, important and crucial reactions to the discovery of the new historians came from Palestinian scholars themselves, which was a critique of the entire method of the project of new historiography. And that was, why did nobody look in the oral history evidence or the evidence of what Palestinians had already been saying about what happened to them in 1948? And so there was a bit of a backlash. And I think this backlash can tell us something about what kinds of voices are permitted to narrate the history of Israel and Palestine. And that battle or that reckoning is something that is continuing. Just last week, if you see on the slide in the top left, there was a front page story in Haaretz, both in Hebrew and English, about the discovery of new documents about pillaging and plunder of movable objects from all of these towns and villages that an Israeli historian has uncovered about the destruction of Palestinian homes and Palestinian society in 1948. There also, in the bottom right, you can see there was a very important evidence last year of how the Israeli Ministry of Defense was suppressing a lot of the evidence of the expulsion of Arabs in archives, so not allowing access and material to get in. And there's also, of course, the question of access, who has permission to even travel to Jerusalem to get into these archives. What does it mean for Arab researchers, Palestinian researchers, who are often systematically denied access to the archives? And so this debate, I think, is a good framing device to think a little bit about how the entire field of Israel-Palestine itself has been shaped by these questions around the politics of knowledge production. And if we turn to the next slide, we can see the ways in which this hasn't only been a question revolving around Israel and the Palestinians. It's also emerged as a site of struggle within Israel itself about which histories are being told about Israeli society and the Israeli past. I think we have to go back one slide. But this first, this photograph is an art installation by the Israeli artist Meir Gal in 1997 called 9 out of 400. And what Gal was doing was critiquing the marginalization of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, Mizrahi Jews, in Israeli school curriculum. He was extremely critical of Israeli textbooks because the Israeli textbooks often only focused on the history of European Jewry, of Ashkenazi Jewry, and that there was systematic deletion of the history of Jews who came from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And this critique, the reason that the art project is called 9 out of 400, is what Gal was showing were the pages of the official textbook that he used in his high school in the 1970s, where only 9 pages out of the entire textbook discussed non-European Jewish history. And so Gal inaugurates this critique of a Eurocentric view of the Jewish past and the Israeli past that had marginalized or excluded non-Ashkenazi subjects. And this is part of a wider debate and a wider opening within Israeli society and culture to account for a much more diverse constituency. That debate is something that has continued, and it's centered on the idea that there is a denial of a Jewish Arab identity, of Jews who came from Arab lands, from North Africa and the Middle East, and that irreconcilable Mizrahi denial of its own past was something that Gal and others have critiqued, and it was instantiated through the educational curriculum. And the way that Gall, in some sense, and others around him shifted the conversation, if we go to the next slide, is to bring out narratives of the Israeli past that were often elided from the dominant frame. And one really interesting example was an event in 1959 known as the Wadi Salib riots. These were groups of mostly Moroccan Jewish immigrants who had come in the early 1950s, settled in Haifa, and who were outraged by both police violence against local Moroccan Jews and also against the living conditions in the neighborhood that they were living. You can see here they're marching with an Israeli flag that's dripping or covered in blood. And this was a portrait that was on the front page of Ha'olam Hazeh, one of the prominent left-wing news magazines. What was left out, in a way, of the debate around Wadi Salib, which inaugurated an entire kind of a nationwide set of protests that got a huge amount of attention in Israel and really is kind of the seed or the birth of the social justice protest movements that would happen later, is the very place that these riots actually erupted. Because what do we know about the neighborhood of Wadi Salib? Well, this is actually one of the core Palestinian neighborhoods in Haifa that was destroyed and plundered in 1948. And so the discourse around the riots, in its own way, was also happening on the back of the erasure of Wadi Salib's Palestinian history. We know from the diaries of David Ben-Gurion, one of the leading figures in the Zionist movement and the first prime minister of Israel, he wrote in his diary about, quote, the total and complete robbery in the neighborhood that was perpetrated by the Irgun. There were clear signs of plunder of objects and libraries of the Palestinians who had been living there. And so there had been in this city of Haifa 70,000 Arabs and 70,000 Jews before the 1948 war, and many of the Arab homes that were plundered by Jewish neighbors. And this is something that's been discussed by Adam Raz in his new book about this history of plunder. So again, we can see the ways in which the history of the region is forced to contend with these double silences. If we turn to the next slide, another example of this question of challenging certain dominant narratives erupts in the early 1970s, where we get the creation of the Black Panther movement in Israel. And this is, in some ways, a kind of child of the Wadi Salib movement, a group of disaffected Mizrahi Jewish activists who feel that the economic conditions, as well as their treatment at the hands of the police, are unacceptable. And as you see on the left, they use the sign of the panther. Again, there was a really interesting transnational history of the way they borrowed from the iconography and the ideology of the Black Panther movement globally. But again, if you look at this photograph, there's no even evidence here of an Israeli flag. It was an explicitly non-national or anti-national protest. The interesting thing to say, just briefly about the Black Panther movement, there's a lot to say, but one is the ways in which they try to integrate into the political system in the aftermath of these protests. And it's an uneven history because the struggle against the state and against economic injustice, of course, raises the question of, well, what about the Arab population, both in Israel and the Arabs who were living at the time in the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli occupation? And that tension within the Black Panther movement illustrates some of the ways in which the questions around both race and the questions around social justice are coming up against questions of belonging and inclusion in the Israeli state. And the effort to move into electoral politics by this movement did not necessarily end up completely on the left, but actually many of the figures involved or many of the followers of the Black Panther movement also give power to the rise of the Likud government of Menachem Begin in 1977, and we see an empowering of the Mizrahi community on the right. If we go then to the final slide of something I wanted to sort of talk more about in its most recent events this summer, is this question of how the BLM protests have actually shaped a certain discourse that has now emerged in Palestine and in Israel today. And this is what happened after the killing of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. What you'll see here in the top right is a protest poster of Floyd next to a young Palestinian man named Iyad el-Halak, who was killed the same day as Floyd. He was hiding out in a garbage room where his caregiver, he was autistic. His caregiver had pleaded to the police officers not to shoot him in both Arabic and Hebrew. The police had shot him at close range. Days after his murder, protests took place in cities in both Israel and the West Bank, including Haifa, Ramallah, and Jerusalem, where some of these photographs are from. And many who took part in the demonstrations made an explicit connection between Black Lives Matter protests in the US against racism and police violence that had been unfolding and what was happening in Israel and in Palestine. And the question of these links between BLM, Palestinian rights struggle, it was not new. It had been going on for several years. It had started already around the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And the question I think to leave you with are both about how far can this transnational solidarity go, and what are some of the limits or ways in which it breaks down. And because today in Israel, Palestine, the contemporary discourse is very much one oriented around decolonization, not necessarily, certainly among Palestinian activists, not necessarily one around state building or the sort of traditional two-state solution that had been the dominant frame of thinking about the political struggle. So how do we think then about these lineages in the context of this wider frame? And so I thought I would leave us there just to kind of give you a sense or an example of the ways in which these conversations are both shaping the field of Middle Eastern history and Israel and Palestine in particular, and how I think their resonance today can tell us a great deal, both about the utility and the value in thinking critically across these disciplines, and also maybe some of the limits we might want to explore together in the Q&A.
Thank you, Seth. That was absolutely wonderful. Now we'll be turning to Dan, who has Melanie's presentation, and he'll be playing that on his screen.
Hello, everyone. If you're watching this video, then unfortunately I've fallen prey to the dreaded freshers flu, despite not being on campus or even teaching this semester. So I'm probably in bed, dosed up with night nurse while you're watching this. I'm so sorry that I'm not around in person this evening, and not to be part of what will definitely be an excellent conversation. But I'm so grateful to the brilliant Zain for inviting me to speak on this roundtable with my esteemed colleagues. And I hope that we get to do this again in the future, preferably in person. I also want to say a huge thank you to Zain for organising such a brilliant and much needed week of activities. Thanks, Zain. So I am Melanie Ramjashan-Bold. I am an associate professor in the Department of Information Studies. And the work that I do is really at the intersection of contemporary book history, so that's 20th and 21st century, and children's and YA literature. So I'm coming at this from multiple perspectives. I'm going to just quickly begin with my standpoint. Colonialism is an epistemological project. It is as much about modes of thinking and knowing as it is about domination and subjugation. And those ways of knowing and thinking survive in the institutions that grant our work symbolic value. And that also materially support our livelihoods and research. So my approach to book history is mindful of the disparities that condition our work, and I try to move against them in various ways. So decolonizing book history for me has been a kind of double act of critique and counter discourse. Critique involves reading very familiar objects differently. So I would read a children's book, perhaps a classic like The Secret Garden, but I might not read it in the same way that it's been read by, say, a white scholar. I might read it from a post-colonial perspective, for example. So critique involves reading a familiar object differently, But the other part of decolonizing book history is the practice of counter discourse, which is choosing different objects of study. So again, that is perhaps choosing writings or readings of the subaltern. That's groups that are, historically denied access to hegemonic power. So in my case, I'm interested in readers and authors from minoritized and marginalized groups. Although I'm also interested in the publishing industry in general, and there's lots of interesting conversations going on about it, decolonizing and diversifying cultural output at the moment. Excuse me. So critique and counter discourse are fundamental to book history and what decolonizing this practice can do. So we've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to speak very quickly about my work, which looks at inclusive youth literature. So that's books for children and young adults by and about minoritized and marginalized people, and also why this matters. So just to begin with, the cultural industries, and that includes the publishing industries, are fundamental in shaping how we perceive difference, particularly notions of race and ethnicity, because they help to produce social meaning and shape the public sphere where ideological values are disseminated and challenged. So the culture we consume is important for identity formation, especially for a younger generation, because books for young people are a celebration, reaffirmation, and dominant blueprint of shared cultural values, meanings, and expectations. And exclusion from this world can result in a symbolic annihilation. So the access and availability of quality, and I'm stressing quality here, inclusive books impacts student achievement, which leads to more engagement and improved literacy. Additionally, the books we read as children have the potential to shape our minds and lives. This has probably been best described by author and academic Redeem Sims Bishop in her article Mirrors, Windows and Sliding Glass Doors. So reading is not simply just a tool to build literacy, it's an important way for children to understand their place in the world. To use Bishop's analogy, children's books can act as mirrors to reflect the reader's own lives, but also as windows so readers can learn about, understand and appreciate the lives of others. The absence of quality representation of minoritized or marginalized characters in children's literature can influence how readers form their identity and also shape their perceptions of others in relation to the world around them. So Bishop warns, and this is a quote, "When children cannot see themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part," unquote. So this goes back to this notion of symbolic annihilation. And Frantz Fanon explored the racial pathologies in children's comics and stories to show how stereotypes were constructed and recreated, which in turn perpetuated systemic racism. So Fanon argued that alternative representations are crucial because damaging misrepresentations can lead to children from marginalized groups becoming alienated or rejecting their cultural heritage. So like I said before, books can also impact the views of those in the dominant group, particularly if the stories being reflected are oversimplified or overgeneralized. So according to Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. It's therefore important to combat these prejudices as early as possible. So therefore, the children's and YA book market has the potential to be at the forefront of educating and informing young people about important social issues, including representation. So there's actually a very long history of misrepresentation, cultural appropriation, and negative stereotyping in youth literature. In the UK, many representations of people of colour written by white authors have been shaped by and have shaped racial stereotypes. Famous examples being works by Enid Blyton and Rudyard Kipling. So this type of hegemonic nostalgia is still an important driver in children's fiction today, with problematics being republished and fostered across multiple different media for modern audiences. So I'm just going to give you a quick anecdote about this. So in the early months of 2020, even though it feels like a decade ago, and during Black History Month in the US, Barnes & Noble and Penguin Random House announced a series of 12 classics with covers, but not content, that reimagined protagonists as people of colour. So of these 12, 5 are regarded as children's classics. So it was The Secret Garden, Treasure Island, Peter Pan, The Wizard of Oz, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So the premise behind this really ill-advised initiative was the question, what if your favourite literary character contained negative depictions of people of colour? This was, of course, met with considerable criticism, with many industry insiders saying that the initiative appropriated the current demand for more representative literature for its own opportunistic ends. By depicting people of colour, these covers give children a false sense of representation. Upon opening the book, readers would realise that the characters on the cover were actually nowhere to be found inside the book. Instead, they might actually be confronted with problematic depictions of people of colour, certainly in the Secret Garden and in Peter Pan. So this type of corporate multiculturalism, to use Stuart Hall's terminology, capitalising on the current trend of diversity, is not uncommon and is actually really quite prevalent within the publishing industry. So these kind of practices and general outdated preconceptions and attitudes towards representation obviously have consequences, and I've outlined some of them. And these are magnified and especially poignant if cultural gatekeepers hold and disseminated them. And I suppose this is where my work comes in. So the enduring reputation of these classics has meant that children across generations are seldom to escape this legacy. Surveys with British teachers consistently highlight the limited range of reference that teachers draw on to develop their knowledge of current children's authors. So this usually consists of classics, bestsellers who have disproportionate promotion, or childhood favourites. Parents often fall into this purchasing pattern as well. So this means that whilst more representative and inclusive books, ones that offer better portrayals of marginalised groups, might be available, they may be undermined by the precedents that classics have amassed. If we want to address this cultural inequality, then it's important for publishers, educators, and other gatekeepers to expand the range of literature in cultural output, in our classrooms, libraries, etc., beyond the pre-existing canon, and to understand how text and writing is underpinned by ideology and the value systems of that particular time, and how we and they can challenge that. So my teaching and research basically explores how to best incorporate a more nuanced sense of cultural awareness as a critical literacy we should have as, as educators, as youth literature researchers, as book industry professionals, as book historians. So I enter this conversation via the context of cultural production with an emphasis on the inherently political acts of writing, publishing, and reading, and also teaching youth literature. My work examines the experiences of authors of colour, people who are notoriously underrepresented in cultural production, and who create counter-narratives, and also the impact of these counter-narratives and their work on marginalised and minoritized readers. So just to note, counter-narratives do not replace the dominant narrative. Instead, they offer a voice and a space for marginalised groups to be heard and understood. Counter-narratives are particularly useful for challenging essentialist identities created through imagined communities. Consequently, counter-narratives, challenge hegemonic perspectives and stereotypes, and thus empower marginalised and minoritized authors and readers. For gatekeepers of children's literature, developing this kind of professional and personal critical consciousness about racial, cultural, and ethnic diversity is a necessary hallmark for interacting with our increasingly global, diverse, and I mean diverse in the broadest sense, and complex world. So I teach the next generation of publishers on the publishing area at UCL. So these issues absolutely inform how and what I teach. I've given, the example of how the publishing industry have, and prominent gatekeepers have gotten it spectacularly wrong. So fundamentally, it's very important that I do not end up perpetuating the status quo through my job, and that I'm part of the cultural shift in children's literature and cultural production. And I suppose this is the reason that it's important to do decolonial work and engage with the historical legacies of racism and other structural oppressions in children's literature and cultural oppression in book history. And to also give my students the tools to do this as well. This obviously helps us all engage critically with power and hierarchies in what we're reading and teaching, interrogate our own assumptions of the world, and then engender a better sense of self-understanding. I make this explicit to my students at every opportunity to help them consider how to take these critical reflections forward into their future careers. And as future decision makers, ensure that they are not reproducing outdated and damaging norms and are instead challenging them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for playing Melanie's wonderful talk. Only wish that she was able to be here with us synchronously. Next, we have Professor Feroz Vasunia.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by just saying thank you to Zine for organizing this very important event and this very timely event. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to all of you on this important subject. Thanks as well to Paul for moderating the discussion, and to all my colleagues as well who are speaking on this panel. I'm going to talk to you about classical studies, Greek and Roman studies, and empire, and address the topic of decolonization from that particular perspective. So let's begin with a detail that you might find interesting. In 1938, which was the last quote-unquote normal year in India, in British India, before independence. That is to say, it was followed by the Second World War, and then the independence movement itself got very popular. So in 1938, 6 of the 9 provincial governors in India had studied classics in university. And of the other 3 governors, 2 of them had been to the University of Oxford. And there's a connection between Oxford and classics that we'll see is very prominent in histories of the British Empire. It's still staggering to think back, though, at this particular time, that that such a large number of people were effectively under the rule of people who had studied Greek and Latin effectively in university. So let me get into the subject in a little more detail then, and talk a bit more about the implications of the study of classics and the British Empire. Were classics and the British Empire implicated in each other? Yes, I think the answer to that is very clearly yes. So if we look, for instance, at the members of the Indian Civil Service, and this is the civil service that effectively ran British India in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, many of these civil servants came from a background in Greek and Latin studies. And it's not just that they came from a background in Greek and Latin studies, but the exams were basically set up so that they would attract large numbers of students who were very good in Greek and Latin. Greek and Latin were thought of as being the perfect training for the administrators of the empire in India. So men such as Thomas Macaulay and Benjamin Jowett effectively arranged the exams, the entrance exams for the Indian Civil Service, so that Greek and Latin counted for a very disproportionately high percentage of the marks. And further, they tried to rig it so that people who were from Oxford and read greats also benefited and that were disproportionately represented in the ranks of the Indian civil service. They were very successful at this, and many of the administrators in India who were part of the Indian civil service, who had a great deal of authority and clout and power in running the country, came from a background in Oxford and in classics. So in that sense, you might say, if I may perhaps stretch the analogy slightly, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, comes from a background that is all too familiar. That's to say, he comes from a background of Eton and Oxford classics and goes on to run the country. This is a pattern that we would recognize very readily in the 19th century. So the Indian civil service is one instance of how Greek and Latin were instrumental and supporting the running of the British Empire, but we can think of numerous other ways in which this might be the case as well. So for instance, a lot of the British administrators in India, in the Northwest and elsewhere, were very interested in the actions of Alexander the Great. They wanted to know where he had been in India. They wanted to map out his movements, to track his motivations, and they wrote a great deal about Alexander in India. Remember, Alexander comes all the way to India, and then that's as far east as he gets, and then he turns back and starts moving in the direction of Babylon and towards Greece. So the British in India were exceptionally interested in Alexander the Great. There was a fantasy on the part of many of these colonial administrators that they were themselves walking in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. And this fantasy is something that we can see quite explicitly in their writings, in their diaries, in their journals, and so on and so forth. And this interest in Alexander the Great also trickles down into the first English language histories of India, which pay a disproportionate amount of attention, which give a very large number of pages to the Greeks in India, to Alexander the Great in India. And subsequent periods of Indian history, which are in fact very well attested, are underplayed in these early histories of India, and that's because the authors were coming from backgrounds in classics and writing about subjects that interested them. So we might say that in these various senses, Greco-Roman antiquity and the British Empire are deeply connected. To give you yet another example, in the second half of the 19th century, the Roman Empire becomes an especially popular subject of study at universities. And this is partly because of the enduring attraction of Greek and Latin among the British educated classes, but also because Britain's empire is becoming larger and larger and larger. And so it reaches its high point around 1900 or 1910, shall we say. And so the Roman Empire held out the example of a multi-ethnic, multinational, overseas world empire, which is what the British Empire was striving to be, and in many respects was. So the study of the Roman Empire was therefore all the more attractive to British writers, thinkers, and intellectuals. And in the second half of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, in fact, an interesting subgenre emerges in the literature, and that is comparisons of the Roman Empire and the British Empire. And we see books on this topic, we see articles on this topic, chapters are devoted to this subject. About 10, 20 years ago or so, we were seeing books and articles comparing the United States of America to the Roman Empire. Well, 120 years ago, it was the British Empire that was being compared to the Roman Empire. And this, of course, also had an effect on the way in which the Roman Empire was being studied, and the way in which it was being taught, in which the way in which research was being carried out in the Roman Empire. The history of Roman Britain is itself quite illustrative in this regard. In the late 19th century, it was quite customary for scholars to present the Romans as bringing civilization to a benighted population that was largely ignorant, illiterate, and uncultivated and uncultured. And so even British scholars saw the arrival of the Romans in Britain, in the ancient world, as something that was to the benefit of Britons. Gradually, this picture has now been complicated, but at that time, it was suggested quite clearly and aggressively by leading scholars, historians of Rome, archaeologists, that the Roman Empire was a civilizing force, and it brought peace and letters and roads to the natives of Britain. This is, of course, a familiar line in empire, you might say. There's a similar line taken about the British in India. The British brought universities, they gave the English language, schools, roads, etc. The railways, all of these are credited to the British. So the British are seen as bringing large numbers of benefits to the native population through the empire, and it's argued that without the empire, the country would not have all these technologies or these universities and these institutions. In the couple of minutes that I have left remaining, I just want to say a few words about decolonizing classical studies, decolonizing Greek and Latin. And I think one way we might do this is to make ourselves aware of these histories of classical scholarship, of Greek and Latin studies, of the uses of Greek and Latin in the 19th century. We might want to think about how we teach antiquity to our students, how we teach the Roman Empire, how we teach poets such as Virgil to our students today, and how what we say to our students today often has an intellectual genealogy that can be traced back to events, to debates, to intellectual currents in the 19th century. And lastly, I might say that one way to do this would be to bring in perspectives from outside of the non-European world, to look at responses to antiquity that are outside of Western Europe. And at the moment, we're in fact having a deeper and far richer sense of non-European reactions to antiquity, and this seems like a very good time to incorporate these into our explorations of the ancient world. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that and hand it back over to Zain. Thank you.
Thank you, Feroz. That was another fantastic talk and several hard acts to follow, I think. And so it's a pleasure I did not realize I was going to have until earlier today, that I would be able to speak alongside my esteemed colleagues. But I hope to bring some insight, at least into the study of Anglophone literatures. First off, by just questioning what it is when we say decolonize. Because according to Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang's now iconic 2012 essay, the very title of it says, decolonization is not a metaphor. They call out how easy it has been for the language decolonization to be taken up by educational advocacy and scholars as a general metaphor for improvement. Instead, they recenter the demand that decolonization is about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Decolonization should not be a euphemism, a synonym, a trendy phrase. Indeed, a key point they make is how the decolonial desires of even non-white, immigrant, and post-colonial peoples can reinstate settler colonialism through resettlement, reoccupation, and reinhabitation. Decolonization as a metaphor becomes part of what they call settler moves to innocent that try to resolve guilt and complicity, but still reproduce settler colonialism. And there are gestures of critique that will maybe seem familiar, which in their gaze of critique end up unsettling us. For instance, there's the dictum to decolonize the mind that comes from Paulo Freire's work, but they say is an ahistorical abstraction, or the way that the identification by other peoples of color that we're all colonized ends up absolving us from our own complicity in the settler colonial project. Even social justice work, they point out, anti-racist work, can appropriate decolonization when it refuses to account for the material realities, especially of land, and if it's purely anthropocentric, or if it advocates for redistribution of resources, as like the Occupy movement, without actually attending to where these resources come from. And these two scholars call for us instead to adopt an ethic of incommensurability so we can build more just solidarities rather than turning to decolonization as metaphor. But Tuck and Yang were writing in the context of occupied indigenous land in settler colonial nations. So about myself, I was born, have lived, and was educated on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, Cayuga, and Musqueam peoples. These places might be better known by their names: Toronto, Halifax, upstate New York, and Vancouver. My family is from the abandoned colonial outpost of Hong Kong, a place I've never been, but I've definitely been told to go back to more than once. And when people say decolonize in the form of heart of empire, what does that mean? After all, we're not occupying land that we can return. And so I'm wrestling with what it means to decolonize in this space in general. How can we ensure that decolonization is not a metaphor? But then in my own field of literary studies, how can it not be a metaphor when the study of metaphor is so important to our work? And I think that this question of thinking about justice in literature is something that runs throughout how we continue to try and justify the study of literature and its relationship to the world. And yet it ends up being a very messy relationship, which tends to have some central assumptions that my work tries to critique. So for instance, one way we often justify the study of literature is the way that reading about minoritized people helps you understand them better, and that sympathy should then lead to right action. And in my work, I'm interested in how this goes back to Harriet Beecher Stowe's 19th century American novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a global bestseller, where at the end she says the phrase, "To feel right is the first step to right politics." And now I think it's clear that in the cultural imagination, Uncle Tom's Cabin is seen in a particular way. The fact that the very phrase Uncle Tom is seen as a slur, which ends up perhaps overly simplifying this very complicated, although also deeply racist novel. And what we see now, I think, is the way that sympathy is often used as the bad emotion, the one that tries to connect but only reproduces inequality. Instead, we see in conversations that we've seen as the updating is empathy. Like sympathy is the bad one, empathy is the more just one that gets to the form of connection that sympathy simply aspires to. And yet, if you read the work of philosopher Adam Smith, where he actually talks about sympathy, the theory of moral sentiments, you realize that his definition of sympathy is basically how we talk about empathy now. And so what do I make of that? I think it's one of these cases where we're trying to update vocabulary without actually changing the systems behind it, that we've sort of confused the signifier of the problem with the problem itself. And so because of that, my work is interested in unfeeling. So unfeeling not as the position of elites, where we're usually used to thinking about the unfeeling elites as the people have to be imposed upon to be made to feel properly, but actually what does it mean to be unfeeling as a tactic from below? Not to have to prove your feelings to the powerful, to recuperate the accusation of bad feeling or unfeeling that no, we actually just feel like you, and instead to suspend that gesture and to attend what happens when you don't have to simply prove and be recognized as feeling. And so I look at all these moments as forms of refusal, dissatisfaction, dissent, and sometimes just exhaustion. And I'm interested in looking at unfeeling to sort of complicate an uncritical universality that is usually only whiteness overrepresented, and how to make space for the messy or counterintuitive that does not seem to lend itself readily to a usable politics according to a colonial paradigm of recognition. And in my work, I explore variously queered, racialized, gendered forms of unfeeling, like Oriental inscrutability, attributed particularly to East Asian people and particularly Chinese people during the Chinese Exclusion Act at the turn of the last century, where Chinese people were also feared crossing borders. Frigidity, particularly as this queer feminized form, which is associated with lack of interest in the proper imperatives, heterosexual female imperatives of family and husbands. And then I'm also interested in, say, forms of unfeeling, like being unsympathetic to whiteness becomes a condition of possibility for some writers for the convergence of Black and Indigenous solidarities towards a reimagining of the world. And I see this as part of this continuity with movements like Black Lives Matter and Indigenous movements of resurgence, such as against the Dakota Access Pipeline, as well as Idle No More. These different forms of refusal and trying to push against the sort of bounds of how representation and politics and the operation of feeling are supposed to work. But why? And I think a lot of my work sort of comes out of the trajectory of my own lived experience, thinking about being a student of literature. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. And what was sobering for me is that I had a great time, but I recently had a friend who was a post-colonial scholar employed by the department who wrote a fiery denunciation of my alma mater, comparing how post-colonial literature has become compartmentalized as global Anglophone literature in ways that he said was analogous to Grenfell Tower, and sort of saying that all non-white literatures have just been sort of pushed aside and compartmentalized and sort of left to rot in the other parts of the curriculum. And that sort of made me think like what my undergraduate experience with the study of literature was like. I remember that I actually avoided studying anything having to do with Asian diasporic literature. I thought that if anything had to do with about race, it was about Blackness, the primary modality of it. And yet I didn't allow myself space to be critical about my own positionality of it because I wasn't, say, looking at Asianness. At the time, there was little to no discussion of Indigenous literature. And so there's no way that did we know or even fully reckon with our place on Haudenosaunee territory. And so for me, thinking through my positionality as someone in the Chinese diaspora helps me to be a better thinker, to help think comparatively and relationally across forms, across geographies, across relationships. And this is how I find that literature is very useful for me in terms of how I think about my interaction in the world, that learning how to read better is not about finding the hidden meanings of text, but how to read better and how to read differently, how to attune our sensitivities to different aspects of the world around us, different aspects of text, different aspects of any aesthetic object. And I'm interested in, again, reading against the grain, hence me being interested in the unfeeling parts, not just the ones that seem to usually reach out to appeal to our our And I think it's an urgent task when we consider our position at UCL for the reasons I had sketched earlier in terms of our institutional history, but particularly within the arts and humanities. So to give you a statistic, if you look up our institution's demographics, the latest demographic report for employees was October 2019, and arts and the humanities has the worst percentage of academics of color at 5.73%. That means that there are 11 of us in arts and humanities. And I think this is an important thing to acknowledge as a part of the production of knowledge and creation knowledge and sharing of knowledge that we're engaging in this space. And so I'm very grateful for the teaching award I won a couple of years ago. But at the same time, I want us to sort of push back against the sort of obligations that might end up structuring a type of recognition that would let someone like me become complacent. I don't want myself or any of us to simply be grateful for that position, that we should be happy with just achieving a certain percentage of Black and other people of color on syllabi. I want us to be able to write better, think better about race and other modalities of power, and especially intersectionally, rather than having to do simply from a defensive position where we're just trying to prove that the topic of a tutorial essay is valid in the beginning. I don't want to have to reduce literary and aesthetic complexity to mere ethnography and claims about authenticity. And so I guess the question I ask for you is, what does the work of solidarity for Black Lives Matter look like through literature and literary studies? Thank you. And now I think for the roundtable portion, if all of our participants could turn on their cameras, that will allow the Zoom meeting to pick us all up and I think display us at the same time. And I'll turn things over to Paul Gilroy.
Well, thank you very much, Sine, and thank you all for such a stimulating and thoughtful collection of presentations. I was frantically scribbling, trying to think about how to be able to address them all simultaneously, and what, in the few minutes that are left to us, will be the most productive thing to do. And I'm really grateful to Zain for the shape of her presentation in particular, because she took us at the end of that into a discussion, or took us towards a discussion, it seems to me, of solidarity. Of what is solidarity in the context of the codes that we have been considering, and what is the role of humanistic education in cultivating the forms of imagination, the forms of curiosity, the forms of identification, and yes, reading, which are conducive to the production of solidarity. And I want to pose that very much more directly, because I feel it was implicit in all of the presentations that we had. Although there were a number of ways in which people didn't agree, there was an incredible convergence, it seems to me, in the tone and the tempo of the presentations. I mean, obviously, Melanie's not here to speak for herself, and I think I can't address critical remarks to her presentation in her absence. But I was very struck by the what survived in that of a notion of ideology that seemed quite mechanistic in the context of the presentations we've just heard. And secondly, really to the use of notions of appropriation, which are, I think, complicated by the depth of the different instances and cases we've heard presented. So I'd like to ask you each, before we turn it over and I start looking into the chat for things to put to you, what you feel about this question of solidarity directly. And perhaps, Seth, you could start, because your presentation really did speak to that very vividly.
Well, thanks, Paul. And I think that the question of solidarity is very much on everybody's mind in the context of Israel and Palestine. What interests me is, in this instance, the limit of solidarity, and in particular, why it is that we can talk about BLM, but we can't really talk about Palestine and Palestinians. We're still stuck in the same trap that Edward Said was talking about in the 1980s and 90s. It seems, and this is something borne out by the protests, but also borne out by discourse more broadly around this question, that even when, you go back to one of the photographs from the protests, when many of the Israelis protesting in support of BLM were doing it without a kind of interrogating of their own situation and what is happening in Israel with the question of the occupation and the question of secondary citizenship for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So what I'm curious about is how far solidarity can take you outside of religious or ethnic lines in the context of Israel and Palestine. And this is an instance where the Jewishness embedded in the state and embedded in things like the nation state law passed in the summer of 2018 really render problematic this idea that you can have solidarity beyond racial or ethnic or religious divides.
Thank you, Feroz. Do you want to speak back to that before we hear from Zain?
Sorry, yeah, I'll just add a couple of brief comments, if I may. Following Seth, I think I agree, if I understand him correctly, that what I find difficult actually is arriving at a position of solidarity in the current climate, in our current situation, and that there are so many obstacles to that coming to a place where one can actually where one could talk about questions of decolonization or questions about race and ideology in a manner that is rigorous and sophisticated is difficult, and there are explicit barriers that get in the way of this. In the field that I'm in classical studies, for instance, talking about race is still remains a very challenging subject. It's very hard for classical scholars to talk about race. They seem to be incapable of talking about it in a manner that is sufficiently grounded. And there was an incident last year at our annual meeting in North America where a young black scholar was told that he had a job simply because he was black. And this accusation was hurled at him in public by another scholar. And that people can say such things in public tells us a lot about the state of the discipline. There's also, so a second quick point, there's also a sense that the ancient world offers a kind of paradise without racial prejudice in it. And while there is some truth to this view that racial prejudice wasn't quite configured in the same way that it is in modern times, and with the advent of modern slavery, there are nonetheless regimes of oppression and hierarchies that we find in the ancient world which infiltrate the category of race. And so it's a complicated subject that still needs to be addressed and discussed. So I think that until we actually tackle these difficult subjects, the question of solidarity is still an open one.
Well, thank you very much. Zain, turning to you then, it seemed to me that you were, on the one hand, calling for solidarity and new forms, new ways of thinking about solidarity in these testing circumstances that we've had described, both institutionally and politically in the world. But there was also, I felt a strong sense that your interest in unfeeling was in attention with that, because it seems to me that it's very hard to be in solidarity with people with whom you have no sympathy. So I'm kind of interested in what resources you bring to the problem of seeing solidarity. I mean, I guess I'm a dinosaur, so I'm going back to the idea that actually I'm a defender of sympathy. I'll be honest and say that. So it's very exciting to hear you articulate the possibility of solidarity without it. So I'd really like to hear if you have a moment now before I've asked the other participants if they would like to put their questions into the chat. So while perhaps they're thinking about that, maybe you could turn to that question.
Yes, so that's why it's very important in my work that I'm still talking about solidarity despite also talking about unfeeling. I think that it's more that allowing space for the seeming negation of unfeeling that allows us to recenter the things that we usually think of sympathy around different concerns, as opposed to just sort of assuming a default. And so, for instance, in my work, I'd briefly mentioned that this sort of unsympatheticness towards whiteness ending up structuring a type of Black and Indigenous solidarity, which I see is happening in the work of Martin R. Delaney. For those of you who are not as familiar with him, he has written one of the first novels published by a Black American during the 19th century. He was very multi-talented. He was an abolitionist. He was both a collaborator and often a critic of Frederick Douglass, as well as part of the first class of Black men admitted to Harvard Medical School, although they were not allowed to graduate because the white students protested their presence. Anyway, he only wrote one novel, but what I think is remarkable in it, even though it's often characterized as being like this formative text of Black nationalism, the way that he thinks is he showed it's very important to think about Indigenous solidarity. And indeed, he has the whole chapter with meeting with the Choctaw Nation before meeting with all these different representatives of older Black radical movements in the Dismal Swamp in Florida. And I think it sort of harkens to a moment that is not as acknowledged in this famous exchange he had with Frederick Douglass in the letters that were published in Frederick Douglass's paper, where briefly he turns to this analogy of this, what he called an old American story about an Indian hunting with a white man. And it's interesting because up until that point, he doesn't really like use fiction very often, but it's important for this rhetorical moment where he draws this analogy, and at the end he says, "I feel somewhat like that Indian." And so that is what I compare to, say, Adam Smith's construction of it, that I think that in the novel, he sort of more fully explores the implications of what it does mean to the way that different forms of these dissatisfactions, which are located in a sort of a very particular positionality, that means it's sort of turning away from whiteness, which then can also mean a turning away that in the end, you could sort of say, catches the gaze of someone else who's also turning away. And the way that the seeming turning away can actually mean a convergence. And I think that's what he sort of shows, that he has this whole incident with the Choctaw, which is an interesting decision for those who are not as familiar with this history, because the Choctaw were one of the 5 nations that actually adopted chattel slavery. So it's not like he chose an easy history to be intervening into in the novel, But instead, he decides to have this conversation. And at the very beginning of this conversation between his protagonists and the elders of the Choctaw Nation, a white man comes in and starts hurling around the N-word and trying to distract the Choctaw chiefs from talking to the protagonist. And instead, what the Choctaw chiefs have to choose to do is to get him out of the room. And I think it's sort of this little moment of, we have to have this conversation. It's going to be a hard and difficult one, where we're going to talk about who's complicit in chattel slavery, who is complicit in colonialism, the way that Indigenous people in Africa are treated versus Indigenous people in the Americas. But in order to have that conversation, we need to sort of temporarily recenter who the conversation is around. And so that's how I see Unfeeling in that particular moment. And I think that solidarity, as my two colleagues have said, is really hard, but it's also because we have to bear in mind that solidarity is a process and it's imperfect and we're going to fail at it, but we have to just keep trying, which I think is particularly difficult. And I think one way it becomes difficult is, like, I've been giving the statistics about percentages and numbers. And on the one hand, we're sort of in this defensive position of trying to advocate for more people in the room, which then perhaps pins us into what can be a sort of more simplistic form of identity politics. And yet I see it as sort of like a starting point, as they say. It's not just about percentages on a syllabus, that on the one hand, we have to get more people in the room because that changes the condition production, but also we can't allow those differences to ossify into the point that we can't collaborate and be in solidarity, however imperfectly, in order to try better next time. So.
Well, thank you very much. I'd love to talk to you more about Delaney, because I've written about him too, and I'm very interested in his...
yes, I know you've written about him.
For the Gospel of the Toothbrush and so on, who's dealing with native peoples of West Africa. Anyway, well, a couple of questions have come in on the chat, which are connected to one another, and which I think will be a really good way to draw things to a close if we can, because we don't have much time left. One of them really is about how to make sure the idea of decolonization isn't just a buzzword in our institutions. And the second one really relates to the idea of a transdisciplinary approach to both solidarity and decolonization. And no, hang on a minute. Yes, that's right. And whether, all right, I don't know. No. It's really about how to hold on to this process as a political process, as a transformative process, as something that in a way undoes the disciplines which are so deeply implicated, as Feroz showed us, in the patterns of colonial and imperial administration that have been so catastrophic, both for their victims and for their perpetrators, in different, though not exactly equivalent or similar ways. So how do we keep contemporary politics alive in the process of decolonization inside and beyond the university without it degenerating into a buzzword? Who wants to kick off with that easy, simple, straightforward question?
I'll just say something quickly while people come up with more informed and sophisticated responses, which is that, yes, I mean, I think that there's a tension there between wanting to teach in a way that is honest and alert to questions of history and intellectual genealogy, and that are alert to method and so forth, but at the same time there's an urgency, there's an energy and an urgency and a drive that comes out of movements like Black Lives Matter, and one wants to retain that and incorporate that in one's own teaching and research. And I find myself that there's a kind of tension there, but I think that one of the salutary effects of Black Lives Matter is that it's shaken people up and stirred them into thinking, in fact, that even if you don't get everything right, it's all right, because these conversations can't wait any longer, and we need to be moving forward. So in my own teaching, I've resisted the idea of teaching a course simply called race, because I want to show how race is complicated, how it's connected to other discourses, other forms of oppression, and so on and so forth. But now I find that to me to my own self sounds increasingly like an excuse not to tackle the subject. And so I think that it gives us the kind of impetus to address these questions head on. Back to you.
Maybe I can step in here and just say, I think part of the answer to Elaine's question is also about insisting that certain topics have a place and should and can be taught. And I say this as somebody who works on Israel and Palestine, sitting in a Hebrew and Jewish studies department. And it's not always, from a disciplinary perspective, the easiest conversation to talk about Palestinian statelessness amongst Jewish studies scholars. You know, I've been in situations and scenarios where people don't really want to hear about it and are uncomfortable. I think part of the answer is insisting that there is a way to have this conversation responsibly and ethically, and that you must. And my inspiration on this is that scholars in Jewish studies were talking about power and powerlessness in Jewish history for decades, and they were thinking and interrogating the question of how Jews relate to the state and how Jews relate as a minority to questions of power and powerlessness, and how that changes after 1948. It's a transformation in Jewish history that suddenly Jews are sovereign and controlling over a territory. So the implications for that within Jewish studies or Jewish history are profound, and yet there was always a resistance or a kind of bifurcation that you couldn't talk about modern Israel or modern Palestine in that context. You know, Jewish history was about something else. And I think part of the answer is insisting that it belongs. And I would just say, from my experience just this week, I'm teaching a survey on the history of the modern Middle East, which is the first time it's been offered at UCL. We have 90 students and 30 on the wait list. And almost to a T, every one of them, when they introduced themselves, when I asked what interested you in this module, oh, well, we really wanted something that wasn't about Europe or moving away from Eurocentrism. And part of it is you just have to provide the possibility that they can access and engage in this historical inquiry. It's, you know, part of it is just figuring out where are the gaps or where are the ways in which certain things aren't actually represented. And that in being able to have access to that kind of scholarly knowledge production, it can also then diversify the way people engage in some of these questions across disciplines. So I would say it's both about thinking within a disciplinary context, how you might challenge certain received wisdoms, and then also the act of, you know, offering the possibility of moving beyond what is regularly given as a kind of, you know, baseline of what knowledge is available to study or to learn.
I guess what I want to add to that is the role of our students. We've had so many student letters inspired by a BLM, and I think that has helped to push for real change in our departments and in our faculty in a way that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, and how important that is. And that despite the reactions that these letters get, this is part of the important work. And I think that it's really the students whose energies are helping to propel us. And I'm aware of that coming here, and the work that I've been able to do is also building on generations of student activism of people that I've not even met yet, and the formation of so many of these inquiries, and the fact that there are resources here who exist now that were created in the past few years as a result of student demand. And so I really encourage the students that even though it can be exhausting, and definitely we're very busy with other things, but every time I find myself perhaps on the verge of being annoyed, I realize that that's part of the point, that I have to be always a bit uncomfortable. I have to be continued to be pushed, because otherwise it's very easy to become complacent and let other things pile up. And so I guess that's not really the bigger question of resources, but I do think it is perhaps a real way that students should feel empowered, that their voices do very much matter. And I think the administration listens to students differently sometimes than faculty, and that because the administration listens to different voices differently, that's also why we have to work together.
Well, thank you very, very much, colleagues. Really stimulating, wonderful start to the year in front of us. And I do hope that we won't let this go, and that we'll be able to maintain this conversation and draw in, as some of the chat responses suggest, a wider range of colleagues from across the institution, often in disciplinary contexts which are not as permeable to these discussions as the ones that we've been engaged with this evening, particularly the science from the science sides of the campus and the disciplinary perspectives associated with disciplines where the conversation hasn't even advanced as far as it has for us. So let me thank all of our presenters this evening. I'm really grateful to all of you. I'm sure others will take away a great deal from this. And I wonder if our organizer wants to have the final word.
Just thank you to all the amazing panelists, to Paul for chairing, to all the events team that is running all the 6 weeks of this behind the scenes. There's a lot of fantastic work coming up. Next week is an entire week on gender and sexuality, organized by Natasha Tana. They'll be taking up a lot of the themes we saw about, say, Black queerness, exploring the work of Audre Lorde, queer of color critique with Sarah Ahmed. And this is really sort of this ongoing discourse over the weeks that I hope people will be able to explore, and the threads of continuities between this and, say, the work on the week on environmentalism or the week on internationalism, the way that even though they're themed, them are very much in conversation with each other and they shouldn't be seen as silos. Thank you so much. The start of term is so busy, as I'm sure we all know, but it's wonderful that you're all able to be here on a Friday night, so thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Zain.
Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening. Have a wonderful weekend if you're able to have a weekend. Bye-bye now.